Good evening and welcome to Orkney International Science Festival 2022 in this Scotland's Year of Stories. My name is Eric Walker and it's my pleasure to be hosting this session. Now, I'm sure many of our audience are fascinated by modern forensic crime drama such as Silent Witness, CSI, Broadchurch, Sherlock, Waking the Dead, to name just a few, which shows what an appetite the general public has for this fascinating and essential amalgam of science disciplines used to crack crime and put the bad guys in jail. To give us an insight and a real lowdown into the application and modern developments of forensic science, I'm very pleased to welcome one of Scotland's, if not the world's, leading forensic experts, Professor Niamh Nic Daed. Niamh is Professor of Forensic Science and the Director of the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science at the University of Dundee, and I look forward to talking with her about that institution's work. Rather than launch into a full and detailed biography and career history, and I can assure you that it is a plentiful one, I'm going to enjoy this conversation with Niamh, and all will out in the end. Niamh, welcome to the Orkney International Science Festival 2022. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Eric, thank you so much indeed for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, Niamh, I'm going to kick off with probably one of the most obvious questions, and I'm sure you've been asked it a few times. What is forensic science, and what do forensic scientists do?
It's a really good question. It's a question that we get asked a lot, and it's one I think that has multiple of different answers. The easiest answer is to say that forensic science is the use of science in its broadest church in the service of the law. So we get involved in matters that have either a criminal or a civil, or matters of either criminal or civil dispute. But I think that definition does us a bit of a disservice because it's quite bland and it's very broad-based. And to try to drill into it a little bit, what forensic science is about, it's about looking at or examining traces of ourselves as human beings or our activities that are left behind as a result of our interaction with a space, a crime scene, if you will, or a person, where what those traces do is they give us information about activities or multiple activities. And what we do in forensic science is we recover those traces, we analyze them, we interpret the results of that analysis in a context. The context is how the traces were found, and then we communicate them with either our legal colleagues and with the judiciary, or indeed in this country with the public. So it's quite a broad set of things that we do that encompasses what forensic science is all about. What forensic scientists do in a nutshell is that when they're called upon to help in the investigation of an event, our job is to go to a scene, so go to a place, to detect and identify these traces that I've been talking about, to recover them, so to make sure that we can take them from that place, bring them back into a laboratory in a controlled environment, analyze them with the instrumentation that we have available to us, interpret what that analysis means within a framework of a set of alleged activities, and then communicate that finding to a court of law generally, which in this country means we communicate them to the public so that the public can make a decision about whether or not a person might have carried out the activity that's alleged. So that's in a nutshell of what our job is.
My goodness, it's a fairly broad nutshell to say.
It is.
Yes. And it also sounds there's a lot of procedure, and it'll be legal procedure you will likely have to strictly follow to make sure it all goes well.
Absolutely, and so we're bounded by a set of not so much procedures, but requirements that are put upon us by our legal colleagues if we do end up in a courtroom or doing the work that we do within a context of as I said, a criminal case. But we're also bound by the laws of science and by what we're able to infer by doing science in a robust way. And by that, I mean understanding what it is we're measuring, how we're measuring it, and why we're measuring. But also, we're bound by the types of operating procedures you would expect us to adhere to. So to make sure our machines are working correctly and that we don't over-egg the pudding, as it were, in terms of understanding what we find within context.
Yeah, I like that phrase, over-egg the pudding. Yes, right. Now I'm going to wind way back.
Okay.
When did forensic science begin, or when could it be, thought to have begun?
That's a really good question. So when you look back at, if we go back into the annals of the history books, our first, I suppose, scientific developments or things that you could associate with something akin to some of the areas of forensic science we work in now, go back thousands of years to the Chinese, where they used very simple observations to provide very simple evidence of, in this case, it was a murder case, where a villager was alleged to have done away with another villager by whacking him with a sickle. And the legal person who was adjudicating it asked the farmers to put their sickles on the ground, and one of the sickles had a fly land upon it because the fly was attracted by traces of blood. And that is probably one of the earliest examples of forensic sort of using an observation to imply the presence of a trace, in this case, the blood. If you try to put this into a slightly more modern context, well, then the I suppose more systematized use of scientific investigation in criminal cases, in resolving criminal cases, probably happened in the late 1800s. And that was when we began to see the first discussions about the use of fingerprinting as identifiers. That was done by a Scotsman in a guy called Henry Foulds, who was originally from Glasgow, or studied at least in Glasgow. And there was a lot of debate back in those times. This is back in the 1880s, where there were others involved in looking at whether or not you could use fingerprints in this context, so to identify people. And so there was quite a lot of discourse and debate and discussion going on, sometimes a bit rankled discussion going on at that time. Also around about that time, you had the beginnings of ballistics, so matching bullets to guns, and you had the beginnings of handwriting, which was originally, or some of the original handwriting work was carried out in France. So you had the emergence of this use of science to help investigators, beginning late 1800s, early 1900s. And so it stemmed from there. But we really only began to get well-grounded scientific evidence appearing really when people started to investigate the use of poisons in the Victorian times. Victorians liked to poison each other quite a bit, usually with arsenic or some such. And so there was a lot of work done around that, where you were beginning to use scientific testing. And again, this was kind of in the early 1900s into the middle of the 1900s. And then it was only 1984 when we first began to introduce DNA testing into forensic science. So that's not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. And there are other scientific disciplines that, of course, have emerged since then. So it's a relatively young science, about 120, 130 years old, in terms of the systematic use of a scientific methodology to assist investigators in working out what might have happened in an alleged crime.
Yeah, that's for me. I'm one of these people who watches Sky History, and that example of the Chinese investigator with a sickle, I remember that now that you've told me. Mm-hmm. But what you've just said is, forensic science as such didn't really come together until, as you said, about 1800s. prior to that, you know, I mean, there was lots of techniques, I'm sure, used. You know, I mean, the Egyptians, they preserved bodies, so they had methodology of doing stuff, but it wasn't pulled together. It was the 1800s that science methodology started to come to the fore, not just in forensic science, and a whole heap of things, I think, Niamh.
And it was a period of disruption. It was a period where we were emerging, or in the middle of, or at least emerging out of, in Scotland, the great time of the scientific revolutions, and where there was a lot of discussion about science and about how we could make the world a better place using scientific endeavors back in those times. So it was a time of great enlightenment, and the Scottish Enlightenment in particular was one, I think, that stands out in the context of what we're talking about, because remember, forensic science is it's a partnership between us and our legal colleagues. And the Scottish Enlightenment involved not just science, but also discussions with engineers and with lawyers and with, you know, literary giants and poets and all sorts were all mixed up in that Scottish Enlightenment, which of course was different from the Enlightenment elsewhere. And from that emerged lots of new and innovative techniques and technology back in those days, but also a means of developing that in a way that served this particular purpose. And when you look back at the engagement between science and the public, a lot of it stemmed also around that time. You know, you look at Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, you look at Sherlock Holmes, you look at all of these, Joseph Bell, all of these giants were based loosely, some of them, on Scottish pathologists and scientists.
Yeah, the more I do this type of role at the Orkney International Science Festival, the more I see how Scottish the Enlightenment was more holistic. I think is what perhaps you're coming to, in arts, crafts, science, engineering, history. They were able to, and willing to pull it together and not sort of segregate themselves into just completely into separate disciplines that nobody talks to each other, although I know that happens eventually. But
and we still do that to this day. So the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the Scottish National Academy, has got forensic scientists as fellows, but it also has some of our senior lawyers as fellows. And that doesn't happen anywhere else in the world, as far as I'm aware. So it's very much, Scotland very much embraces that interdisciplinarity. It's in our DNA to be interdisciplinary and to talk with each other, to try to understand, you know, how we can contribute to society and so on.
A cross-pollination of ideas, science, culture, the whole kit and caboodle. Yeah. Now here's a question that's come in from the watching audience, Niamh, and it is: forensic science the same as on TV? You know, I mentioned in the introduction Silent Witness and CSI. You know, how realistic are these very popular TV series compared to, you know, the modern forensic science lab?
Well, I'm sorry to shatter everybody's illusions. The answer to that is no, not really. The TV programs that you talk about, Silent Witness and you know the others that you speak to, are entertainment shows, and they do that incredibly well, and people are very entertained by them. But they probably the thing that is most unrealistic. There are two. One is the way in which technology is the savior, and technology will find the clues, will solve the puzzle, and will get the bad guy. And that's not the way in which it works. We use technology as a tool to deliver for us information, and then we have to evaluate that information in the context of the allegations. So those final evaluative decisions are made by experienced scientists. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it doesn't happen in 40 minutes. So it takes an awful lot longer to process crime scenes, to recover items from those scenes, and then to do the analysis. And one of the things that forensic scientists are to a person and across the many disciplines within which we work is that we're very meticulous in our jobs. We record everything that we do. And in Scotland, what we do is corroborated, so it's checked by a second person. and to the minute detail of what it is that we examine, how we examine it, what we retrieve from those items, how we do our tests, what we then do with the items, how we package them back up, how we put them back to the police force, how they go to court. All of that is really meticulously monitored. It's a thing called chain of custody, and it's really meticulously monitored so that from the time an item is taken from a person or a scene to the time it's delivered into the courtroom at the trial, every second of that item's lifespan is accounted for. And we have to do that.
Yeah, so nothing is shoved into a pocket like you occasionally see in the mythical.
And we, in the real world, we use gloves on our hands, not as little things to pick things up with. So it's as I said, these programs are fantastic because they're great television and they're great for engaging people in the work or in the service that science can play. But they're entertainment programs.
Yeah, they are. They are. Now, I would be doing you a total injustice, Niamh, when I'm sitting here conversing with you and not asking you about you and your career. Could you give us a little bit of insight into that?
Well, it's a bit of a sugary road. It's a bit of a non-linear pathway, a squiggly path, one could say. So I grew up in a family of scientists. Well, both of my parents are scientists. I'm an Irish, you can hear that from my voice, an Irish citizen, and my parents are Irish. But I was actually born in Dundee, believe it or not, because my father was an academic and he had started his first job way back in the 60s in Dundee. And so the family moved over there and I came along. And from there, my father was a chemist and my mother is a botanist. And when we were growing up, science was a topic of conversation. My dad worked in a university. My mother had an interesting pathway because she went back after myself and my brother came along, went back to university to get her PhD. So it was, very sort of, not a, as I said, straightforward pathway. And we came along and when I was probably about 10 or 11, our relationship in the family with science slightly altered because before then, my mum was doing her PhD down in the wilds of County Kerry in looking at the flora and fauna of County Kerry, which is where she was from. And she would drag us, myself and my brother, along out to boglands where she was taking her samples from. And to great hilarity, because she would stick us on a little tonic to make sure that, and told us not to move, and then would wander off into the bog and jump up and down and the whole bog would move. And so all of that was, the sort of fun of youth, as it were. And then things changed slightly because my father in particular, where he worked was near the local police station in the city centre in Dublin, and he used to be pally with some of the guards. And they asked him, would he be able to do a forensic analysis of a sample for a defence, on a defence on a case, a drink driving case or some such. And he did that because he was a chemist, as I said. And from there, he moved on. He was asked, could he do a fire scene investigation for the guards? And he did that. And then that began to open up a very different career pathway for him and ultimately for my mother as well. So they became the first independent fire investigators in Ireland, and they had set up a company and did that sort of work. So it became their business. And myself and my brother used to make our pocket money by sticking photographs of fire scenes onto sheets of paper to put into their reports. But what it meant in all seriousness, what it meant was, apart from teaching us the value of money, what it meant was I saw on a day-to-day basis science being useful, because Mum and Dad would sit at the dining room table. We all ate together as a family, and we'd sit at the dining room table and they would be talking about a case, and they'd be talking about what the fire did to this piece of wood or whatever it was, and using that information to try to recreate the story of the fire. And that's part and parcel of what forensic science is. So I got involved or interested, of course, in science, went off to university, did a degree in chemistry and mathematics, went off to do a PhD, and I did this in Ireland. I did my PhD in the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland in medically related science, absolutely nothing to do with forensic science. I was rebelling at that point against Mum and Dad and saying, I'm never going to do that. And then I ended up going into forensic science when I came over here to Scotland. And I first began working at Strathclyde University and then subsequently at Dundee University. and do casework in fire investigations. So, go figure. So I did exactly what my mum and dad did. So, so it kind of went from there, but it started with this real sort of, interest in the world around me and seeing what interest in nature and interested in just how the world worked. But then seeing science as a career that wasn't just something that was separated from society, but actually something that could be made useful to society. And that was a real attractant.
Yeah. Now, you see, I get that because I'm a biochemist and I love applied science. And I applied mine to malting barley and making whiskey.
Oh, super. What a good job.
It was lovely. It was lovely. I also know Dundee well because I was born and raised in Brechinnieve. So
okay.
very well. Yeah, it's not far away from Dundee at all, 20 odd miles. I don't know the Leverhulme Institute though. Could you maybe give me a bit of information on that?
Sure. So when I joined Dundee, I went to Dundee to work with one of my great friends, a lady called Sue Black, now Baroness Sue Black. And Sue and I are great pals, and we decided, we've been both working in forensic science for quite some time, and we decided that forensic science is not without its challenges, and there's a lot of challenges around the robustness of the science. So how valid are some of the things that we do, particularly around looking at matching patterns of fingerprints, or bullets to guns, or tools to tool marks, or shoes to shoe prints. So there's not an awful lot of robust science underpinning those examinations. And it was coming under quite a lot of flack, both here and abroad in particular. And we thought, we need to do something to shift the status quo a little bit. And so we joined forces. I came from Strathclyde and joined Dundee. And we wanted to really start to bring that interdisciplinarity back into what was becoming a siloed system. So while some of the scientists found communication across the barriers of, say, biology and chemistry somewhat challenging, the challenge was much bigger between the scientists and the lawyers, or the scientists and the investigators, the police, or indeed the scientists and the public. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to disrupt all of that in a positive way. And so we started by applying to the Royal Society for a grant, and they did. They gave us one. So we brought together a meeting where we brought the senior lawyers to that meeting, almost covertly, because the scientists didn't know that they were sitting in the presence of some of the country's most senior lawyers. And it began a conversation. Around about that time, the Leverhulme Trust were launching a new set of grant proposals, basically a new grant scheme, which was going to invest £10 million across 10 years in centres for disruptive research. And we thought, that's the thing for us to do. So we applied to the Leverhulme Trust, were the recipient of one of those grants. And that grant established the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science. So we're funded by a charity, the Leverhulme Trust, and we're funded for 10 years to the tune of £10 million to disrupt forensic science and the way it thinks and the way it interacts with its other partners. And so we've now been running for 6 years. We're just into year 7. And what we do is we look across 5 pillars of activity. So all the research we do are linked to one of these things. And it goes back to that fundamental, what is forensic science about? So we look at how we detect stuff. So whether it's blood or DNA or digital evidence or whatever it is, how do we detect it? How do we recognize what it is that we're seeing? How do we do an analytical comparison of that with something recovered from a victim or from a scene? How do we interpret and evaluate it? And how do we communicate what that means in a case context to real people in the real world who make up our juries? And so all of our work, as I said, pins to one of those pillars of activity. And we're very good at detecting things. Our PhD students build databases of what we call ground truth, so known data, which means that we're getting very good at recognizing things. We explore machine learning and artificial intelligence and deep learning, much to the horror of many people, to see how good we can be at comparing things and test people against the machine, as it were. And then the evaluation and interpretation, we do a lot of work looking at how materials transfer from person to person. So if we shake hands when we ever meet in the real world, and then I go home and pick up a knife and stab somebody, not that I would, then does your DNA end up on that knife? And the answer is it could do. So we don't really know about the transfer and persistence of materials. And we need to know that in order to evaluate what the traces that we find mean. And then we do a lot of work on science communication and on teaching people how to communicate science in an effective way so that we can make our findings understandable to the public, because they're the ones at the end of the day in court that make a decision about guilt of an individual. So that relationship is the most important one.
That's absolutely interesting, because we started off saying that Scotland, right, everything in the Enlightenment, everything was holistic and everybody worked together and were on board. And you've just identified, there's a period in time not that long ago that things were starting to get a bit disparate. And it's all about credibility across all the disciplines, but especially to the public.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the sort of beating hearts of the centre is about public engagement. So we have a public engagement manager. It's fantastic, Heather Doran and her team, and they work with everybody across our centre in training them in public engagement. And we do a lot of that sort of engagement activity and working with schools and science centres and festivals and so on to talk about how forensic science works and what we need and where the deficiencies and the limitations are, because that is just as important to know.
Yeah, it's just that I go back to, all I know about forensic science evolution was probably in the mid-1800s when they were doing that phrenology, the lumps and bumps in the head and your eyes are too close together, which has been well disproven as a pseudoscience, I know. And then you had, was it the guy Henry you mentioned coming at the back of it in the back end of the 1880s, 90s, and he had this wonderful fingerprint classification method that he had to sell to people and the public to make it credible on the back of that phrenology tobacco. So, I'm sure that still happens today, but...
we're still identifying or looking at fingerprints using the same sorts of characteristics. So the comparison of fingerprints is still done in a way that if we transported ourselves back to 1912 or the 1900s, we would recognize the tools that we're using, that we still use today. And in part, what we're exploring with our colleagues in fingerprint examination, in a partnership with them, is, are there better ways of doing this? Are there better ways of coming to conclusions about whether a smudgy print lifted from a crime scene could be, or a smudgy mark lifted from a crime scene could be the fingerprint of an accused person?
The other one I've got, I get see the science disciplines, the chemistry, the toxicology, pharmacology, all that stuff, botany, everything. I can see those. Now, again, going back to TV series, and I'm going to go back to a cracker here, where you've got this psychological profiler. Is that a scientific discipline that you would incorporate nowadays, or?
It's a very good question, and there's a whole area that is really rapidly developing called criminology. And criminology is looking, and I'll paraphrase it, it's not my field, so any criminologists out there, please forgive me. It's looking at not just the behavior and motivation of human beings to do things, but it's also trying to link that to other risk factors relating to how people have grown up and their sort of relationships in and with the world. And so there's an emergence, I think, of a much more grounded perspective around forensic psychology. It has had its trials and tribulations, that's certainly true. But it's not something, it's certainly got a value, and it's not something we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of being too concerned and worried about it. It's certainly an area that's got value. I think it's one that there's a potential, like any application of science, psychology, or even forensic medicine, of being sure to articulate the boundaries of it, so that its limitations are known when it's put in front of people as a type of evidence to explain human behavior. And that's really important, so that the person who's making the decision about whether they believe that or not knows the limitations of what people are talking to them about.
Yeah, it's only one thing in the whole soup of
Yes.
tools that you're using. Perhaps it's not the be all and end all, as it's sometimes portrayed in the in those again, these enjoyable, entertaining drama. What would you say are the challenges that forensic science faces currently?
I think there's multiple challenges. I think first and foremost, when we look at forensic science in a UK context, there's considerable differences between how forensic scientists do their business as organizations across the United Kingdom. So in England and Wales, forensic science is entirely privatized. So it's all private companies that tender their services to the police forces, and the police forces will pay for those services. That is problematic because it's a commercialized service. In Scotland, the Scottish government pays for the forensic services. So it means that their provision of forensic science is much more holistic. It spans some of the specialisms, whereas a commercial company might find that investing in a specialism is not commercially viable. So we've got a very different system here in Scotland, and equally Northern Ireland is similar to the Scottish system. So that's important, because that allows the forensic services here in Scotland to approach the investigation of crimes in a way that enables them to perhaps bring more resources, but also bring more tools and technologies to a particular event and its investigation and examination, because resource is an issue. So that's one of the things that's a challenge, is resources and how we use them. The other thing I think that's a challenge in a more sort of global sense or broader sense is the implementation of technology. Forensic scientists are technology adopters. We like technology, but it has to be fit for purpose. And that in of itself brings a challenge, because our purpose isn't just scientific anymore. It also has to satisfy our legal colleagues, so that it is the science that we use or the tools that we use are robust, that they stand up to scrutiny, and that they are fit for the purpose that we're implementing them in. And we also have other adopters of technology within our domain. So the police like to adopt technology as well, but the police are not scientists. And so there's sometimes a disconnect between the technology that the police want us to use and the technology that we're comfortable using. So technology and keeping pace with it, but also not letting it dictate our pace is something that's important. And then the third area, I would say, maybe two more, the third area I would say is about research and development, because there's very little funding for research in forensic science. And as I said, we're very fortunate that Scotland has this amazing well-funded research centre. We're the only one in the UK and one of the only centres of its type in the world where we can look at doing research in really applied areas like transfer and persistence. That's not very sexy to research. And so people aren't going to give us money to research it in the conventional sense. So doing that research is absolutely critical to understanding what traces mean when we find them. So research and funding is a real challenge and a real issue. And then the last challenge, I think, is being able to communicate what our data means in a case context in a way that the triers of fact, whether it's a lawyer or whether it's a member of the public, can understand the relevance and the limitations of what it is that we bring to them and to their deliberations.
You see, those techniques, I remember, again, going back, 1978, 79, when it was my honours year of my undergraduate biochemistry year. And messenger RNA, the use of it was just starting. And I remember one of my lecturers saying, this is going to have huge impacts on a whole raft of things, vaccines, forensics and things like that, and I couldn't quite see it. But of course, now you can see it. I mean, my goodness, that must be one of the biggest developments of being able to multiply trace DNA into suddenly sample.
Definitely, but again, so forensic DNA profiling was came into its own in the mid 1980s and was first used in a case in around sort of 1985, 86, and our technology has got really sharp since then, to such an extent that when we started doing DNA analysis, you needed something the size of a new 50p piece, a stain that size, to get a DNA profile from it. Now you can get a DNA profile from a single cell. So the technology has really developed. I mean, it's amazing technological developments. But the bits of DNA we analyze haven't changed. So we still look at the same bits. We don't look at the whole genome. And many people expect that we do, but we don't. So we only look at 10, now 17 little bits of our DNA. And because the technology has advanced so far that we can get a DNA profile from a single cell, then when we take a swab of the knife that I stabbed somebody with earlier on, you take a swab of that, then you'll get my DNA and your DNA and maybe other people's DNA off that swab. But what we're looking at is 17 parts of the DNA of those 3 or 4 people. So it's like 3 or 4 profiles all sitting on top of each other. So now our problem becomes mathematical. It becomes, how do I unmix that complex soup of DNA? And the challenge with that is in some cases, the mathematical unmixing of that is done by algorithms, which are in black boxes, where we don't see how the mathematics works. And they're commercial products. So I could give you the same set of DNA profiles in one commercial black box product, and I'll get one set of this is the contributors. And I put the same data into another black box and I'll get different answers. And that's problematic. Now, it's not problematic if we analyze all the samples with the same black box, but it is if you've got different people analyzing it with different black boxes. Yeah. And that presents a real challenge for us. So our technology there has driven us to the point where we need a mathematical solution to unpin or unpick the evidence that we find.
That's not the only discipline. It's like astronomy is very like that as well, Niamh. And I know people in like sixth year at school have been encouraged, for, data processing and algorithm handling to try and bring something out of the apparent mess of data that you get. But yeah, I'm always wary of it, I have to say, as a member. I'm always wary because, it's easy to draw the line to fit the point, so to speak, in old parlance. But yeah, if going back to the developments, what are a couple of developments in your career that you would say have just had a massive impact?
DNA, obviously. I mean, that's the one that revolutionized, I think, how we do our business and how we investigate crimes right the way across the piece. I think the other, it's no longer an emergent technology. But it's improving and developing at such a fast pace, and that's anything to do with digital. So the advent of mobile phones, the advent of digital technologies, the way in which we communicate with each other, the way in which we now communicate with our houses, so that you have your cup of tea in the morning and you use the last of the milk in the fridge, and your fridge communicates with the shop, and the shop has a robot deliver it to your door by the time you get home. This is not beyond the bounds of possibility now. So all of that, the technological revolution that's going on around us and keeping pace with that. So that's going to be, it already is, incredibly disruptive in a positive way, but it's making us change how we do our work. So things like that. And I think the other thing that has become very important with our abilities to try to use science in a productive way is enabling people to understand it. So I think the rise of science communication and the tools that we as scientists need to develop in order to communicate with the public, in particular around digital evidence, is also going to be something that's going to, if we allow it, is going to really change the game.
Mm-hmm. Now, if I were a school student today, or a university student, or indeed someone in another job, and I thought forensic sciences for me, what would I do? What's the best way of going about getting into serious forensic science?
So for me, my background is in chemistry and mathematics, so I didn't study forensic science at university. And I tend to be quite old school in my thinking in that respect, because what forensic science needs is it needs good scientists. And to be a good scientist, you need to spend time learning chemistry or biology or zoology or whatever, your physics, mathematics, whatever it is that floats your boat. So I think we need the science first. Normal career pathways in forensic science in terms of education is a good degree in natural sciences, then a master's degree in forensic science of some sort that enables you to now understand the principles of forensic science, so what it is that we're trying to achieve as a forensic practitioner. And that goes back to what I said at the beginning, so understanding the importance of traces, how to recover them, how to analyze them, put them in context, and so on. So that requires quite a lot of evaluative thinking and problem solving. and attention to detail. And then from there, some people will go to do a PhD, but most entry level now into the profession, certainly in the UK, is most people going and have a master's degree. If you want to do crime scene investigations and become a crime scene investigator, which in Scotland is also based within the Forensic Science Laboratory, then a master's degree might not be your pathway in. And actually some of the skills that you need for crime scene investigation are real attention to detail, to have an ability to spot things that are, perhaps unusual in backgrounds. And some crime scene examiners come in from art degrees or design degrees or photography degrees as well, or having that sort of background. But I think there's the emphasis and the skills that people need are numeracy, so mathematics, science. But as I said, there are these other pathways as well to come in. There's lots of degree courses that are offered in forensic science. It wouldn't be my preferred option, simply because I don't think there's enough time to learn the fundamentals of the science that you're going to need to know.
Mm-hmm. So for someone who's interested in finding out more about forensic science, or indeed considering a career in forensic science, is there any reading or online resources that you'd recommend?
You can certainly look at our website at Dundee University. We've got, and if you put in Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science, you'll find us. And we've got resources and information there about careers in forensic science, as do other universities in Scotland and elsewhere. And they provide quite useful information with regards to, how you get into this business and what it might be about. And others are just to read more widely about it. You can get lots of useful information off Google and off other sort of search engines that gives you a bit of a flair and a bit of an understanding. But then I think what I would suggest as the next step is to go and talk to people. Forensic scientists, while they might not be that prominent out in the world, if somebody is a genuine interest in what it is that we do, then we are always happy to sit down and to talk to people and to explain, particularly to young people, what forensic science is about and what sort of a career it is, to help people try to make up their minds.
When I was doing my research, Niamh, I came across a game called The Curse of the Burial Dagger.
Yes.
I think it's been it's been published, is it, by the Leverhulme?
Yes.
Collaboration between the Leverhulme Research Centre. Can you give us a bit of background into that, and would that be useful at all?
It may very well be. It's aimed at sort of late primary school children, and we worked with a fantastic company in London called Fast Familiar to make this game. And it's not the first project we've done with them. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to make a puzzle solving game. It's about a murder, where people could work in teams, young people could work in teams to solve this murder by solving clues. So there's little mathematical puzzles in there, and there's various other sort of pattern matching puzzles that people have to use their problem solving skills to solve, and that gives you a little bit more information, and then you have to pool all that information together, and then you have to make a decision as to who was the person who did away with the Lord Hamilton, I think his name was, in the game. And so it's all about talking about science and using mathematics to solve puzzles and using some of the skills that you need in the real world if you want to go into this particular business. And so we've played it with a lot of schools across Scotland and down in England and Wales as well, to great success. I think young people really like it. So that's something we launched last year.
A bit more sophisticated than Waddington's Cluedo, by the sound of it.
Don't ever dish Cluedo.
No, I will never dish it. I was brought up on it, so no, never will. Niamh, what we'll do is see some of those references you've just given. What we'll do is we'll make sure those go into the description of this YouTube.
Super.
This YouTube webcast, and we'll do that. Niamh, we have come to the end of our time. And I did say beforehand that I would get completely engrossed in, and I have. I want to thank you very much for coming along and giving us your experience, your career history, your insight into past and current developments in forensic science. And I hope you'd consider coming back to this Orkney Science Festival again, because it's fascinating. And I hope you can manage to come up to Kirkwall itself. It's
Oh,
wonderful.
I would absolutely love to. I've been to Orkney a couple of times, and it's such a beautiful place and a really inspiring, peaceful, wonderful part of the world. So I would very much welcome another opportunity to come up. And thank you so much for asking me. It's been a real pleasure and most enjoyable.
Well, Niamh, thank you very much. I'm just going to do some festival housekeeping. So, as I say, the housekeeping is our next event. It starts in a short while at 5:15 p.m. It's in the Orkney Theatre in Kirkwall Grammar School, and it's also being live streamed on YouTube. It's called New Life for the Land and Wildlife and People. And Scottish biologist and ecologist Derek Bretzwell, he's going to describe a novel approach to regenerating the whole ecosystem of land and wildlife and people based on earlier Scottish ecologists and Nordic countries. So once again, thanks to Niamh and also to the invisible tech team in the background who magically enable these events to be brought to you. For now, until the next time, goodbye.